As you can all imagine, I don't know if I'm your first hybrid panelist or speaker, but I'm excited to be with you all. And I think they have worked out some magic that I'll even get to sit on my panel that follows just after this. So I also hear that you're quite an engaged bunch, so I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. What Carl and I discussed, I lead ESG, so environmental, social, and governance for ServiceNow and the finance strategy. And when I started at ServiceNow, I was the chief of staff to the CFO. And so I've been very close from a workforce planning perspective for the organization. We had our own early in career program within finance that has become a model across the company. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. But when I spoke to Carl, and we've been having lots of great conversations about just the trends that he and the team are seeing, the types of questions that have been coming up, we agreed that some of the experience and how we've navigated some of that here at ServiceNow, and then just, based on past experience, could be an interesting point of conversation, almost as a case study. And like, what did we do, and what are the challenges we faced, et cetera. And so I'm going to walk you through some of that. I'll be very candid. Most of these slides are pictures. I want this to be conversational to the extent that it can be, although I know I am hybrid. I'm hoping there's some mics in the room for those of you who have questions and want to engage, but I'm just going to sort of set the context for the experience that we had and the journey that we took to really continue to be engaged with our early in career and just net new talent when you think about talent that might be transitioning into technology or transitioning into high growth SaaS company as well. And so that hopefully will give you some good thoughts, and then we'll obviously engage in a discussion before we transition to the next panel. I wanted to start with this quote from Richard Branson. I always strongly believe that employees are a company's greatest asset, but I really liked the additional punch that he puts here around people being your product. They represent so much the organization, and a statistic that we learned from a Columbia professor who came to do a bit of a talk with us here at ServiceNow, the executive leadership team and the board, was that I think he said by 2025, this was a few years ago, by the way, this was back in 2021, he said by 2025 or 2026, if I'm not mistaken, something like 70% of the workforce is going to be millennials or younger, with the incumbent retirements and so on. So there's just a very significant portion of folks that are going to be quite junior, and they're going to have very different expectations, of course, which is something that I think about from a holistic ESG perspective, but then also quite a different experience over the last couple of years for those of them that are coming straight out of college. So I'm responsible for that program, specifically within finance, and advising the rest of the talent organization on some of those. When we started the COVID journey, when we all did, we all quickly flipped to going home. We were able to do that quite easily because of so much of our work is facilitated by a workflow solution. But it was funny because as we started in that path, my boss at the time, the CFO, she's still my boss, in fact, she would say, I just got used to assessing how much we were getting done, how much was complete, and how much the progress we were making by what the parking lot looked like in some ways. So at like 5 o'clock on a particular day, she might walk out and kind of see, or like look out the window and see just how full it was and understand, okay, like the work is still happening, things are still happening. Just this weird gut check that we relied on presence to really help us feel confident about productivity. So when she would turn around at 5 p.m., let's say, and say she couldn't find someone, it would be concerning to her. But as we entered into this phase and we recognized that, hey, we're not going to see that anymore, we had to get comfortable with the fact that we can have a productive workforce if we know how to engage them. And let's all be honest, this is what most of us are seeing in our parking lots these days. I know some days of the week, this is what it looks like, usually on Mondays and Fridays. Even in our headquartered office, it's quite sparse. Folks that are coming in, it's just not quite a lot. And there was a lot of anxiety, especially from, I would say, more seasoned generations, let's say, in the workforce, around what this meant. Was work still getting done? Were people being productive at home? Are we still seeing all of the deliverables met? And I recognize there's still a lot of insights that are being gained around productivity, But the reality was, like I said, owning our early in career program for finance and advising on the company's early in career program, we knew a few things were going to be really important to that particular group of talent. It's a preference for flexibility. And even as we've tried to go back to the office, there is now this tension for folks who literally started with us during COVID, their first job out of college. They're now used to what they call the quiet of working from home versus these really open offices, and you've got a lot of engagement and a lot of conversations happening, voices carrying, et cetera. And so it really challenged us to think about, what does that mean to continue to provide flexibility? Both because we also started to see a very different mix, right? I think about 30% of our employee base now is actually fully remote. And then the other, I think about 10% or so are fully on site. And then the remaining are remote or hybrid. We recognize that there was this tension. And so then we started to ask ourselves the question of, how do we want to use space and time when we are together? And some of the obvious ones that were easy to answer are things like an all hands, right? Opportunities to have engagement, specifically, especially with leadership from a messaging perspective, the passing down of key messages, that was critical. We do the same in most of our functions from time to time. Obviously, they're still hybrid because you're connecting to other offices across the world, but ultimately, there was a lot of importance put on engagement. And the other answer was around innovation. I'm starting with what the ServiceNow questions were that needed to be solved, because then we would kind of walk that down into, what does it look like for solving for kind of earlier in career talent specifically? Well, we knew that these were things we wanted to solve for, which was creating space for engagement and enabling innovation that needed to happen or was better facilitated in an in-person experience. Well, this was a little bit of a joke here, but just a recognition that there used to be a time where if you let people know that there was going to be a taco truck or some sort of free food, that would get people in. So that those sorts of benefits would draw a larger crowd, at least with respect to getting people into the office. But you can't do those all the time. Again, being in finance, not financially sustainable unless that's a part of your strategy, which is, free food or otherwise, right? And we realized moments like that where we were focusing on some sort of a draw that would be an actual cost to the business wasn't always really that effective, to be honest, because folks are, really appreciating, like I said, that flexibility. So we started prioritizing very specific things. And I don't think I'm going to shake anything up for any of you, but I will talk about how that impacted specifically our earlier in career or our younger talent as many of them relocated to be closer to offices. So the first, and I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague, Tanya Thornburg. I don't think she's in the audience because I think she too had gotten pulled away from being able to participate, but partnering with workplace services to create engaging spaces that felt a bit more really collegial in some regards, but also just created space that said, hey, this is for connecting, was a big, important part of that. And also creating a space that felt different than working from home. Some of the images I had from before, that I chose not to include were pictures of parents who had their kids with them or what have you, but there's often kind of a need to have a bit of that quiet sometimes in the office, but then they want the space to feel engaging. And many of you are embarking on, what does that look like for your clients, or you or yourself kind of thinking about what does that feel like? In the finance building specifically, we have a game room. We have something like a game room in most buildings, but it's very well used. We see people going in there and ultimately creating events around that. So for example, we'll say, hey, we're going to do a little competition where we're going to have almost a competition of, on the pool table or something on the basketball, kind of the basketball game, and sort of see, how people are doing. Those sorts of friendly competitions, things that feel quite collegial, have really created a nice draw for us. Now that's a bit more experiential. it creates a sense that like, hey, I'm building community here. I don't know how many of you felt this way, but I remember my first job, especially because I moved from LA back here to the Bay Area, I was also building my new friend base as well, right? So there is this need to find ways to be able to connect. A number of our talent really enjoyed coming in and being able to, one, connect with each other, but it was also important to be able to like leverage some of these resources. Lots of them appreciated being able to leverage our gym. So those sorts of things around the spaces and how they were using them became really clearly important to them. And they articulated that that's how they were using the office. One of the other things, especially as we're talking about hybrid in its entirety, I did want to acknowledge that we've been really focused on technology as an accelerant here. I have a bit of a screenshot that kind of shows, or a picture here that kind of shows our overall plan, but we have a lot of things that can be either engaged on-site or off-site, right? So there's a lot of our onboarding is all done completely virtually. Fantastic. And so then a lot of the learning and development and all of this other work can happen basically through solutions and technology. So if most of the learning and development is happening in this regard, that formal training is happening using technology, what's left? We recognize that this helps us, especially as we continue to be hybrid, we continue to be more disparately spread in many locations. And so what else was left? Well, now we had to define the moments that mattered. And so a program that we have instituted is a bit of a brown bag series or set of sessions. These are hosted by various subject matter experts across the team. They get access to Gina in small kind of forums where they can ask questions. This is a picture of a slightly different discussion, but it creates an opportunity for people to connect with leaders. It creates an opportunity for people to connect with one another, share their experiences. And so that has been extremely important for us, is to supplement what can be done online with those real world conversations, with those real world discussions, and also allowing for people to know what else is happening across the organization. I'm responsible for our rotational program. It's about 50 souls spread around the globe. There's a mix of early in career straight out of undergrad, as well as what we call early in career out of their MBA. I'm also responsible for the intern program as part of the finance function. And so all of these people are really looking and craving those opportunities to engage, to ask their questions, et cetera. And what we have done programmatically is created this series that supports them in being able to explore, to learn more, to understand what else is out there, especially as they want to continue to expand their skills, find out if there's a stretch assignment in another space. And so it takes two pieces here. Obviously, it's coming up with the programming, but it's also supporting the subject matter experts as they come in to have those discussions. So we do have a program manager who's responsible for helping with this and really running the series, engaging with the talent, the early in career talent, to understand what's important to them. But we have found that this has made a huge impact. So when we are running a monthly kind of brown bag that allows for folks to come in, it really clarifies that and really makes things really a bit more interesting. We have a dedicated day as a function, the finance function. We come in on Tuesdays. Most of the company, I would say, comes in on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And those are Team Tuesdays. But then also when we think about that second day of the week, we're trying to create a bit more buzz. We may pick a Thursday afternoon to have one of these training opportunities or one of these brown bag opportunities and have a manager, a director, or a VP host that conversation. So that's a way to create engagement, help facilitate, kind of the exercise of networking and so on and so forth. So that's been really important. I'll talk a little bit about training here in just a moment. One of the things I wanted to highlight, and again, myself and Carl had a pretty fun conversation about this, is managing by walking, but really creating or cultivating as many organic interactions as possible. I'm using some obvious like stock photos here, but when you think about the experience that our talent, especially our earlier in career talent, is having, because I'm the sponsor for these 50 people specifically within the function, but then even when I'm participating across other parts of the organization, I carve out time first thing in the morning and in the afternoon. And a number of other leaders have adopted something similar that works for their schedule. What does that mean? For about an hour, I'm actually walking around, talking to the talent, engaging with them, etc. I let them know in advance, a week or so in advance, that, hey, I'm going to be in the office next week. Just wanted to let you all know I'll be around, or so on. So then they know Edawa's going to be in on Tuesday. She's got that schedule. And then they also know Edawa walks around. She'll pull me aside, have a conversation, or even just share some of the things that are going on. I just came back from South Africa, meeting with a number of our customers, and a number of the early in career folks pulled me aside and was like, what was it like? And wanted to understand. And so there is this aspect of cultivating those organic interactions. And they're not, completely organic, because I do want to let them know, hey, I'm going to be in Santa Clara on Tuesday, but I'm going to be in San Francisco on Wednesday. But outside of that, really taking the time as a leader and as an executive to walk the floor, engage with folks, and just be curious shows them that interest. And then that behavior, because so many of us are doing it, has really made our earlier in career talent get excited about showing up on those days, because they know that someone from FLT or from the finance leadership team is going to be in the office, and they may have an opportunity to have an organic conversation, or one of the managers in another discipline is going to be around, and I'm going to have an opportunity to maybe interact with them, to ask questions or what have you. And so that's been a technique that we've been really focused on, is just how do you cultivate and create the space for those organic interactions, the things we all used to do, water cooler chats or coffee chats, if you will. Next has been very much focusing on celebrating and educating around the value created for on-the-job training and coaching. I think that this is obvious for many of us who have had those experiences, that apprenticeship partnership. It's been pretty obvious, but I do find that earlier in career talent, one, it needs to be expressed to them. And then I think at times what I find we need to do a little bit is help them have those moments of reflection to acknowledge that this on-the-job training and coaching is happening, and them gaining something from that. Techniques, again, that we're all trying to embark upon is really around how we have some of those conversations when we're doing those organic interactions around the space. Hey, how are things going? What did you think of XYZ? Or how can I help you with whatever's going on with what's going on for you right now? And we found that has really helped in helping people feel like, okay, when I'm in the office, I know so-and-so is going to be there and I can turn to them and ask questions. Or, hey, when you're in the office, what's the benefit been for you? I think sometimes creating just that moment of reflection we found that it's become stickier with our earlier in career, especially for those who, let's say, were with us in the beginning of 2020, and now it's 2023. We do have, these recommendations and preferences for them to be in the office. But as we went through that transition, helping them have those moments of reflection of the value that they were getting from being there, from being able to turn to their buddy or their manager, was so critical. I'm going to use the next slide to talk a little bit about mentors and buddies. One of the big areas of focus for us in making these sorts of things that feel, again, very basic, but can be a big cultural change. When we started COVID, we were just shy of 12,000 employees globally. We're just over 22,000 employees globally now. So significant growth during COVID and during the last few years. That means a lot of new managers and a lot of new leaders, people having bigger and bigger scopes. And we realized it was super critical for us to really focus on both developing and celebrating those managers. When we've onboarded talent, they often have a buddy. For us in our rotational program, that means they have a host manager. They're not in a rotational program, but they're early in career. They obviously have their hiring manager like anyone else. But ensuring that the buddy and the manager are properly equipped to support that talent, properly equipped to understand what it means to engage diverse talent or work in a hybrid environment has been another really critical part for us. And so we do quite a bit of calibrating, quite a bit of training for our managers. And then the other thing that we've added in the last year or so is a celebration of managers. So we actually have quarterly awards. There are CFO awards, for example, in our function, and then in other functions, they look different. But one of the CFO awards is around excellent management or management skills, and really wanting to celebrate managers who are creating those spaces, leaning into their people, et cetera. And so by creating these sorts of moments to celebrate managers, obviously it inspires them to lean into the training. It also inspires the talent to look for those traits and experiences from their managers. So that's been really, really critical from a success perspective. The only other thing that I want to kind of say, and then ultimately I would love to kind of engage in some specific conversations or answer any specific questions is, for us, we feel very strongly about this, as I mentioned. It basically starts and ends with people. I think what we found, especially with dealing with the earlier in career community, is asking those questions, getting those insights from them directly as best as possible, but also helping them have those realizations has been super helpful. And then I think, again, really focusing on cultivating those moments that matter, having those organic interactions and practicing that has been how we have started to see really that tide change. So Tuesdays, the house is full usually, especially in Santa Clara. We do have a pretty disparately spread Bay Area presence. So now we've got a lot of people heading back into San Francisco, which is a very nice office for us. And then also in the Pleasanton office for folks who are living in the East Bay. I know some of you are not necessarily from those areas, but it just goes to show you that we're able to drive that traffic based on kind of really embracing this. And the moments that matter for us are, team meetings, strategic discussions, all hands, those brown bag learning and development opportunities. And that's on the whole, for the whole function, no matter what level you are, but especially for those who are newer to the function, that's been really important. I have another example that's coming up because I was just having this conversation with the new chief of staff. But ultimately, as we continue to be hybrid and we have employees that are fully remote, what does it look like to support someone who's in an earlier stage in their career? Well, for a lot of our MBAs, they're remote first. What that means is that they get the option of deciding they want to be attached to an office, but often we determine that they're going to be remote first. So what have we put in place? Well, they're welcome to come from an onboarding perspective for 2 weeks, 1 week with their general training, 1 week with their team, and then on a quarterly basis, they come on site to get some of that training. Otherwise, they build it into their schedule. They go into other offices that might be closer to where it is that they live to engage and to create that culture. But really thinking intentionally about how do you create sort of that cadence, that rigor, or those guidelines or guardrails around creating the opportunity for engagement, but then also enabling people to do what is feeling still really good around flexibility, but just making it more interesting to come into the office, making it clear what the benefits are has been really where we've been focused. So with that, we'll stop. Happy to answer any questions that any of you all have, and or even hear some other ideas or thoughts on ways to engage this particular group of folks. I can't hear the room. Carl. Oh, okay. I was like, I'm not sure.
Hi there. How do you pronounce your name? I'm sorry. I don't want to say it wrong.
It's okay. It's Etawah.
Etawah. Hi, I'm Alana. I head real estate and workplace at Zoom. And we are close partners.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I think a few of my friends work there now, actually.
Yes. I had a question about your PM, your program manager that is doing your rotation program. So is the rotation program specifically curated to specific teams' needs? Or is it more of like, here's your playbook, this is like you kind of outline what the purpose is, or is it specially curated by group?
That is a great question. So I'm going to talk about the finance program, and then I can talk a little bit about what people are picking up from it that are applying a similar sort of early in career development approach. So for us, we have a pretty good cadence with all of our host managers, and anyone is eligible to be a host manager. That is either A, an existing hiring manager, or B, someone who has been shortlisted by the leadership team to host talent as either a part of their development or just that they are prepared to do so. We still send them through a bit of training. They articulate the rotation to us through a particular process. So we actually get what is the scope of that? What is the impact? What skills are expected to be gained? What skills are needed to be successful? So we make sure that we've, thought through that. And then we have basically kind of like I don't want to call it a demo day, but each of the host managers will actually present their assignment during sort of like a bit of a road show. So we have a couple of days where all of the talent will sit in and hear from the host managers directly, ask any of their clarifying questions. Our talent will then apply or express interest in particular rotations by ordering them all. And my program manager does a blind matching. What I mean by blind is that the host managers aren't, outside of telling us, hey, we believe someone will be successful in this if they have done XYZ, we don't say, oh, well, did you like Sarah or did you like Keith? We don't give them that option. So we allocate. So it's not, ultimately the program manager facilitates the collection and the verification that these are valid rotations. Now that we also have experienced talent at the MBA level, we have to make sure that the MBA submissions are more rigorous, more kind of challenging based on the skill sets that we hire for. And we go from there. So it is very much that the business articulates its needs. We always get more rotation requests than we have rotators. It's the program's been around a number of years, although we've scaled it. I think it's about 60% larger now, and it's global versus before it was not. And so our program manager is responsible for that facilitation. The other thing that she and the leader are responsible for is also our recruitment. So they work in partnership with our talent acquisition organization to actually recruit the talent. And so they facilitate a calibrated process where they actually train all of the interviewers. We have a standard interview process so that way we actually have equity in that process as well. So I hope I answered your question,
yes,
but if I didn't.
That was great.
Okay, great.
And I do love what's on the screen. It starts and ends with people.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely. Of course.
Yeah, Etawah, this is Kevin. One question I'd have is, what are you seeing in terms of new talent and the biggest gap between new talent and the workplace they're entering into right now?
The biggest gap between new talent and, like, you mean the existing talent base that they're coming into?
I think the work environment and kind of what they're being presented with, the skills that they come equipped with, maybe don't align with a lot of traditional workplaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so what I would say is we're on our own journey here at ServiceNow. We're moving to more of a skills-based approach to even how we're thinking about how we post requisitions for net new talent and so on. We have been on this journey as we've grown and matured over the last few years. So really moving to really understanding what sits from a skills base in our career ladders, in our different disciplines, et cetera. From a gaps perspective, it's funny. I think I'm actually going to answer the question slightly differently. My biggest fear going into like this next space of where we're headed is that people aren't going to have some of the basic experiences that I had, literally going into a warehouse and counting inventory, for example. Like there's just basic experiences that I think people aren't going to have even as they're pursuing like a chartered accountancy or something to that effect. And so that's like a concern that I have. And so the biggest gap between the workplaces that they're joining is you have generations like myself and those that come before me that had this hands-on sort of experience. So how do we create those simulated experiences that allow for them to understand the basic, of doing the math, as opposed to just like throwing it in some sophisticated model that's going to do all the thinking for them. And so I think that's like the greatest challenge for all of us right now, is just defining experiences and projects that allow for them to both develop a true base of foundational knowledge, but also be able to meet the moment, which is much more automated, which is much more sophisticated from an intelligence perspective, AI and all of that. I think the talent we're seeing is coming in with some phenomenal skills, and candidly skills that we may not even know how to take advantage of quite yet, if we're all being quite honest. And so I think they're coming in with skills that we're figuring out how to take advantage of. And I also think that we are trying to develop experiences that really help them have the same foundations. So that way they're not just checking debits and credits. It's not all exception based, but that they understand the basics. And so that's like, I would say, the biggest thing that we all need to, that we all are all really focused on figuring out how we solve.
Great.
I hope that answers your question, Kevin.
Yeah, it does. Especially when you entered on, started with more than half the workforce was hired during the pandemic, and you got new and old, so you got a double challenge there. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And the fact that we went from being not nearly as remote as we are today to fully remote for 30% of our employee base, that's created quite a few challenges on one, sharing of knowledge, creating those relationships and connections and so on. So it has been quite challenging.
All right, other questions? All right, just a moment.
Absolutely.
Hi, Edua. Question, you obviously mentioned the team, and I'd be interested to know the percentage of folks that are able to come into the office versus talent that you have outside of the area that don't come in the office, and how you bridge that gap to make sure everyone feels included.
I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you talking about, of the, let's say, 70% of folks who are A, full-time in the office, or B, hybrid, how many of them are actually coming in? Was that part of the question? I just want to make sure I understood the first half. Or are you just saying, how are you creating continuity of experience between folks who have a hybrid work experience versus an on-site work experience? I want to make sure I got that.
Yeah. I'm just saying that, do you have any fully, I guess the question is, do you have any fully remote staff on your team? And then how do you, that I think that's more the point of the question.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that percentage is, 80, 20, 50, 50, whatever the case may be, but how do you make sure that they feel and are getting the same level of feedback and engagement? Actually, I think the key word, right, is engagement, that folks that are coming in either full-time or hybrid.
Yeah. Okay. Totally helpful in the clarification. So I appreciate that. And thank you. So there's a few different flavors of this. The first is we have employee belonging groups. So those primarily host, I would say, virtual activations with a mix from time to time of hybrid activation. So those serve as a way to create sort of connective tissue from I'm engaged in this culture, I'm engaged in this community. So employee belonging groups is one. Another flavor of that I'm actually responsible for is our Global Impact Council. So Global Impact is the name of our ESG program. And so those councils actually bring employees together for volunteerism and activation and so on. We actually have a Global Impact Council that's focused on remote employees so that they're getting the same sorts of offerings as we would have otherwise. Everyone's experience, I'm going to go back a slide here, is standardized in that you're going to have the same onboarding, you're going to have access to the same technology from an education platform, our FRED platform. Quarterly growth conversations are required for managers. So there's certain aspects of like how we manage humans and people that create a level of continuity. Now, separate from what you just said, which I think, or separate from what I just said, which I think is maybe the bigger point, is how do you make people, sometimes it's like when you walk into an office, and I know many of you have had this experience, there's an energy, there's a buzz, and there's a culture that you experience firsthand that's really difficult to translate to folks. And so what we have found has been very useful, especially with early in career, but even with people who are newer to teams. That was some of the use cases I was reviewing yesterday with our chief of staff and our talent leader, is the reality is we need to bake in-person time. So if that's long-range planning, strategy sessions, specific deep dives and workshops, let's define them and create space, not just for them to come in for that day, for those 2 days, but create space for them to engage with other employees, with other activations. And so we think as much as we can around, hey, we're going to plan this offsite or this summit, or we're going to fly in our remote employees around one of these all hands, and think about running a team session around one of these bigger moments that we're having as a community. And so that's how we try to do it. And obviously it's case by case. I'm throwing a lot of examples at you, but I think that's what I'm seeing is working well is one, you're going to have a remote employee plan for something at onboarding and plan for something periodically throughout the year. You have to do that. And then separately, when you're making those plans, think about how you anchor them around bigger cultural moments for the organization or for the team specifically. So that would be my response to your question. Hopefully I got to it.
No, it was perfect. And I think it's very thoughtful about how you are considering that. And it can go through different modalities in order to extend the reach. So thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, do we have any other questions? If not, we're going to do a bit of a set change, and we're going to bring the panel up, and Etawah's going to pop out of the curtains in just a moment, digitally, of course.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for letting me cover this topic with you all. I'm going to stop sharing so the team can do their magic. But looking forward to the next part of the conversation. Thank you, Kevin. Hi, Kim.
Is this on? Okay, great. Wait, where did Etawah go?
I've got moved.
Oh, she's literally coming from behind the curtain. Oh, there she is. Oh my gosh, that was so funny. I thought she was going to stay up here with us. All right. That's awesome. I love that. Well, while we're getting Etawah set up on her new screen, I'll go ahead and just introduce myself and our panel today. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Vu. I am the Vice President of Environmental, Social Governance, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. That's a mouthful. ESG and DEI at a company called Remitly. We're a global cross-border money transfer company out of Seattle with 10 offices around the globe and 3,000 employees working in all the varieties of ways of work that we've been talking about today. So I'm really excited to be able to introduce our panelists, Etawah, who you just met from ServiceNow, as well as Mark Jacobson, who is the founder and CEO of Terrain Analytics, and also Kalen Rosselli from Proven Recruiting, who is the GM of Finance and Accounting at Proven. And so I'm actually just going to hand it over to each of you to do a little introduction. We're really excited to just kind of dig in further into some of what we just heard from Etawah, but also talk about just some of the ways in which we're seeing trends shifting and changing and how companies should consider the way talent is moving through the market and ways in which we can really kind of respond to that. And Etawah, I know you kind of introduced yourself earlier, and you touched on a couple of different programs, but I would actually love for you, give a full kind of overview of your job. You have a deep scope there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kim. So again, and then for those of you who might have missed my intro because I think we got started, but Edua Dickerson, I lead ESG for ServiceNow as well as finance strategy here. What you were just hearing me talk about is part of one of my favorite parts of my job is I also am responsible for the early and career development here within finance, but then sit as an advisory member for the overall talent acquisition and talent development of our early and career folks. It's been a fun journey. I started out as the chief of staff, and I come to the space of ESG and all of this from a finance and governance perspective, but have really enjoyed the journey that ServiceNow has been on in our hypergrowth, and just really excited to kind of chat with you all. But like I said, talk to a number of folks throughout the organization. Workplace Services sits within finance, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Etawah. Mark?
Sure. Hey, I'm Mark Jacobson, founder and CEO of Terrain Analytics. I spent probably the first 18 years of my career in executive search. Worked at one of the largest search firms globally, spent some time in boutiques, helped get now the 6th largest search firm in the world, a company called True. Built the practice here in San Francisco. I was the first employee, part of the executive team there. And I've also dabbled as an entrepreneur, so tried some things that have worked and not worked, but one of my other proud contributions is helping to start a venture capital fund called Signalfire, which is one of the first data-driven venture capital firms in the country. Premise of data talent leads to great outcomes. We can talk about but it's now close to $3 billion under management in about 10 years. So we're really excited about that.
My name's Kalen Rosselli. I work for Proven Recruiting. We are a smaller boutique kind of staffing firm. We service about 7 different metropolitan cities. I head up the office in San Francisco doing finance and accounting. Proven Recruiting's been in business for about 15 years now. We service finance and accounting, life science, and technology divisions. Prior to this, I worked at one of larger staffing firms that probably some of you guys know, Robert Half, more so in the finance and accounting world. For them, helped the San Francisco office here locally in the Bay Area, and then also helped the LA office as well for them. So came here and adding kind of a different perspective as to kind of what you're seeing in the current market talent pool and kind of what's influencing them to get into an office versus staying at home.
Great, thanks. So let's go ahead and jump into a couple of questions. I want to start off with, we had talked about some of the headlines earlier today. Some of our other speakers have shared some of those headlines. But one specifically that I just caught just yesterday was a Fast Company article that was published with findings from a survey by Deloitte and Workplace Intelligence that warned us that the Great Resignation is not quite over yet. And while 60% of employees and 75% of C-suite executives would consider quitting their jobs for new ones that would better support their well-being, this is where employees and leadership consensus ends. There's a huge disconnect between employees and leaders in organizations when it comes to work-life balance, workplace culture, and personal wellness and health. 75% of employees believe that their health has worsened over the past year, while 3/4 of the leaders believe that their workforce's health has improved. So they're on complete opposite sides. 89% of leaders believe that they're doing a good job of advancing human sustainability, while only 41% of the employees agree. So, how is this showing up in your organizations or the organizations that you're working with? And I'll start off, Mark, with you.
We don't directly work, I think, with that as part of our data set. I think what we see is companies trying to understand how they need to build and manage their workforce on a global basis. So stepping back, I think the historical patterns were kind of easy. You could use large cities and metros as the magnet. You could say, hey, if you want to come be a part of this, come to Silicon Valley, come to Seattle. You see the rise of Austin, New York, Boston, and that's kind of it. The post-pandemic reality is that employees were allowed to go wherever, and I think in an unstructured environment without kind of a clear vision, a clear set of guidelines, it just created a lot of chaos. Factor in a negative economic environment compared to prior years, and companies are belt tightening. So what we're seeing is that companies are definitely trying to figure out what their stance is around having employees in the office and where they're going to put them, as much as how they're going to plan for the future around growth. So, if you are a top 10 employer of a certain function in your region and you want to continue to grow, it's tough to grow in that region. So you're now thinking, should I build a center of excellence? Should I go find lower cost talent? And I think globally there's different dynamics, but companies that we're seeing are planning in office, they're planning clearly, they're doing kind of an economic viability as well as a talent viability strategy. And I think they're trying to be very thoughtful about giving freedom and flexibility and promoting trust to mitigate some of those factors that you mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm curious too, Kalen, in terms of what you're seeing with employers who are taking the steps forward, as Mark has shared. What are those potential benefits or interests that employers are offering, or employees or potential candidates that you are sourcing are expecting? Like, are they expecting, in-office therapists, for example? Like, what are some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah, I think right now for us, kind of what we're seeing this is more finance and accounting related. For us, there's managers and there's leaders. Right? I think there's a big disconnect in a lot of different organizations right now from a communication standpoint, from executive leadership to the leaders in their organization to their managers. There's different messaging being misconstrued. So I think in regards to like an onboarding process, what we're seeing is clear collaboration, clear communication from day one for candidates to get their engagement. If there's not clear collaboration, clear communication, there's going to be a disconnect, and the loyalty and the retention of those top employees will be disconnected in a short amount of time. So some things that we're seeing, so it's more so with like parent support groups, right? Dealing with that, dealing with how to manage kind of having children and kind of dealing with your schedules when your executives are saying, hey, get back to office. So that's one thing that we're definitely seeing. We're also seeing collaborations amongst other managers right now across industries and across different companies of leveraging that line of communication on what you're seeing in different companies and how they're structuring their return to office policies. And then I think the last thing that we're probably seeing right now is in the essence of predominantly with newer people coming into the kind of the workforce and kind of getting into kind of the establishments, is they aren't really, I mean, if we think about how we all got into a business, right? We are going into an office, you get clear communication with your manager, right? These newer folks, they're lacking that, and they're sensing a sense of connection, right? And so they're not getting that from their managers. So I think companies that are adapting policies are going to be able to, in the long term, over the course of the next years, retain the top talent that they're looking for.
Thanks, Kalen. Edua, I saw a lot of head nodding. Anything that you wanted to just reflect on or add?
Yeah. So getting a little vulnerable. I know I'm not in the room with you all, but I'm going to treat it like we're having a glass of wine and getting real here for a second. During COVID, I think one of the biggest challenges that we saw was that talent was concerned about being on all the time and needing to be responsive, or feeling the need to be responsive even when it was communicated that it was okay to have an off moment. So if you're not in the office, you don't have your commute, is it assumed that you're available during the time you would otherwise be commuting? Is it assumed that if I get a note in the evening, I need to be responding to that in the same evening? Or can I have a bit more control over when I work? That was a bit clearer. I worked at Alphabet before coming over to ServiceNow. I knew how to manage my when I'm on and when I'm off a lot clearer before COVID. And I think a lot of employees expressed challenges with boundaries, challenges with setting them, challenges with feeling like they were respected or that they were clear. So I just really agree with the points around how are you being explicit and clear about that, and doing that from a communications perspective early, often. I think the other thing that I really appreciated about what my co-panelists were sharing was just this idea of ensuring that the thread is completely intact, going from executive leadership's intention and their messaging all the way through to an individual's experience. And there's a lot that is required there. There's a lot of alignment. And so I think for us, we found that it was really important that our C-suite was not just talking to our VP, SVP community, but that they were also talking on our people manager forums that we have on a quarterly basis. They need to be delivering some of those messages as directly as possible to the employees. Yes, it's part of our all hands series, but also as part of the manager messaging. So I think just creating that continuity is incredibly important. Again, calling a spade. I work in high tech, so I work in technology. I do think that there's been quite a bit more anxiety over the last, I don't know if I would say it's a full 12 months, but maybe it is a full 12 months at this point, with a lot of the layoffs. So there's a lot of insecurity I think employees are facing in some industries more than others. And then you introduce AI, for example. And so all of a sudden, I think that there's that has added. And so those statistics are not surprising to me. And I think this is where the role of leadership, of management, of all of us becomes even more imperative around, do our words match our actions, and how are we creating more consistency and continuity there, because there's a lot of external factors that are also weighing on. So those are the things that I would add to what was shared specifically.
Great points. Thank you. You also touched upon this earlier in your presentation as well, as just talking about how we make sure that we're inclusive of employees who are remote. being that was the contract we signed with those individuals, right? Ones that were hired because they were remote, ones that decided to be, move because we were all temporarily for a very long period of time remote. What are you seeing in the market in terms of like how this is impacting how we attract or retain that diverse talent who many moved away for a lot of different reasons, right? There's lots of different reasons why people moved away. They moved away for better cost of living, for work-life wellness, proximity to their families or community, for other reasons like safety or for physical or neurodiverse accommodations. Like, how are we seeing that impact today as you're talking to companies about where their talent is, when you're talking about bringing in more diverse talent into organizations? How are those conversations happening with both your customers, but also with employees?
You want me to do it? Okay. I think what I'm seeing right now, I think it's in regards to a retention is if you're not offering flexibility to your people, you're going to lose them. And the second you start demanding in office or some sort of 1 or 2 days in office, those individuals, whether you like it or not, how long they've been with you for 10, 15 years, they're immediately looking to see what else is out there in the market. Because right now the market is still demanding top talent for A+ people, and they will go find it. So I think that's one area that I think just needs to be addressed with a lot of different executives and across different industries. But I think more importantly, areas of how we're retaining folks that have moved away from centralized locations is creating common cultures, common areas that have similarities of those individuals that are in different demographic areas, right? Whether that be doing a remote situation or doing once a month or once a quarter kind of an all hands meeting per se, right? Or finding other avenues to provide communication to those individuals that are in similar areas, because there's a lot of people, a lot of candidates that we work with that are not feeling connected to the company that they're working for because they're so far away, right? And now they're at the point where, okay, well, I'm not connected to this company, so why don't I go find a company that kind of embraces a fully remote situation where that is kind of the culture, right? So I think there's avenues that companies are putting to a place, but it's finding common ground with those individuals and what is important to them.
Oh, I was going to say, maybe Edua wants to comment on this.
Sure. Etawah.
Hi. Yeah, I +1 to everything that was just said. Very, very much aligned. I think this goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about with respect to the responsibility. Stepping back, there's a lot more that we are demanding of people managers today than I think we were demanding of them potentially 5 or 10 years ago, because of how different the space is. And folks historically at a lot of organizations that I've seen, both as customers, I was in audit and consulting for a period of time, but then also communities I've been a part of. A very strong individual contributor can become a people manager. That may or may not have been something that they really wanted to do, but they're leaning in, they're taking on the additional charge, but like really supporting them and learning how to be focused on connecting, on picking up signals when an employee is struggling or feeling disconnected, being proactive about creating moments of connection, setting up those mentor buddies, making those introductions, giving them advice on the ways that you built connections with people who were distant from you. I think all of those tactics become even more important. And this is sort of, again, I'm just kind of going back to the manager playing such a significant role, because that's someone's lifeline often, no matter where you are in the organization, and sometimes no matter where you are physically, your manager becomes such an important part of that experience. And so I think just equipping them with more resources that, yes, are potentially part of policy or part of just kind of cultural norms, but I think ensuring that managers really can lean fully into that, because they become such an important part of the employee's everyday experience. So those are some thoughts. And then the other piece that came up for me as you were talking a little bit, or when you were introing the question, Kim, is just around diverse talent and the need, like speaking very plainly, everyone, we were talking about attracting underrepresented leaders, mid-manager to, directors or even senior directors. Often folks at that point in their lives and their careers have children, or maybe in schools, in communities that they're loved on. they probably don't want to pick up and move across the country. And so then all of a sudden you have this command or demand for remote in a way that's really important, especially if you're looking to cultivate diversity at various levels. And so I think that for us, to your point, to the point that was raised, remote flexibility, it's a requirement to stay competitive, to attract that diverse talent. But then also I think it's a requirement and an onus on the company and the organization to equip and support the manager to create an experience that can feel connected and so on. I'll stop.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think on the diversity topic, it's really interesting because we get requests from our customer base to say, help us think about where we can go to be more inclusive, to hit our DEI metrics, goals, objectives. And a lot of times, you're in a market, we see customers in a market that either they can't afford to be in because they've got budgets and it's like, hey, listen, I can't go compete for talent in Silicon Valley or elsewhere. Where else can I look? They don't know where to go. They don't know what the work population is. How many diverse data scientists are there in the United States? And everyone looks around and like, oh. It's a tough question unless you actually have data that can say, well, here's what we believe, here's what we think, here's where you should go. And it often pushes you into markets that you wouldn't have normally considered. But connected to that is you have to be able to explain that strategy. You can't just have your recruiting team go out and look and come back and go, didn't find it, right? They get fired. You got to go back and say, well, listen, like we're targeting these regions and here's why. This is the industry, this is the function, these are the dynamics, this is like who the competitors are. We know that they hire X, Y, or Z in a certain region. And I think someone, I believe it was you from Zoom, love talking about Zoom in Atlanta because Microsoft made a huge splash moving into Atlanta, and it kind of ran counter to conventional wisdom, which was you couldn't hire engineering talent in Atlanta. It wasn't there. Well, truth is they've hired over 2,000 engineers and product managers, and that profile of an organization looks very different than Zoom. And hopefully I'm going to get this right, so correct me if I'm wrong. But Zoom predominantly uses Atlanta as a sales and marketing office. So very, very small portion product and engineering. But if you're trying to build your organization and you go in thinking, I'm going to go find diverse engineers and I'm going to target Zoom, but they will, you're going to come up short, right? Like, so there's this element of how does data inform your talent strategy, which then connects to what are the tactics and operational things that you can do to attract and retain your talent in ways that are current and modern and consistent. Because the last 3 years, it's been a moving guidepost, right? Like we didn't plan for the pandemic. We didn't always have these values set. So we've been constantly adjusting to moving milestones. And it's been tough because we're afraid of churn and we're hearing things like people are quitting. And you got like a different economic environment, all this other stuff. But like you can actually begin to address some of these DEI goals through data, through better intentional growth domestically and internationally.
Staying on that kind of theme of data and going a little bit more tactical, but back on like the thought of like development for employees or candidates who are interested in further development as they're looking at other companies, how like data obviously helps keep us honest, right? Because what happens, and we know this, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, or comfortable with acknowledging or not, is that when we bring everybody back into the office and we have a percentage of a population that is never going to be close to you in physical proximity. So how do you mitigate things like proximity bias, right? You say, oh, well, this person shows up to work every day, therefore they are a high valued employee, so they should be the ones that get the opportunities. Whereas you may have another individual who's in another location, right? So I think data really helps us mitigate some of that, but I'm curious also, how are you seeing that play out? And I guess specifically this would be more towards for you, Etawah, but also Kalen, if you, or Mark, So, but we'll start with you, Etawah, in terms of how you're thinking about that or how ServiceNow is thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. To your point, data is king and so important, one, to be collecting and then to be monitoring, right? I rely personally very heavily on our HR business partner community to have the data and to have the analytics and to challenge and to provide us with that information so that way I can challenge some of those assumptions that I'm seeing. I am of the good fortune that a decent amount of my team is spread across the United States and even into Europe. So because of that spread, I think the design of my team has helped to address some of that because we aren't all together often. But for other leaders, that has been a challenge and something that we're trying to think about how we create kind of operational intentionality around checks and balances. So even when we do recognition, even when we're doing consensus or calibrations right now, we are asking ourselves and looking and saying, okay, well, how is this impacting what's happening? Because let's say we have a mixed team that has a decent footprint in India, and then a decent footprint here in Santa Clara, and then the rest of it is kind of across the globe. Well, have we looked at how the ratings are sort of distributed between the two regions? Headquarters is where most of the senior executive talent is. Are we seeing some bias in that way? And we ask ourselves those questions and we push on each other in that way. But all of us are really very much trying to focus on the data. None of us are getting it perfect. I want to be really clear. I don't want to make it sound like things are just easy breezy, but the data has really helped us to be thoughtful. And I think we're doing the same sorts of analytics on women, persons of color, et cetera, where we're just looking at those curves, we're looking at the distributions, and we're challenging ourselves on the outcomes, not necessarily saying that they'll change, but then also asking ourselves, have we created space for people to do those stretch assignments that may be different, or maybe they were women or otherwise a minority, and how are we creating those opportunities so that way we can assess if this person has that exceptional or superb delivery, right? So I think it's about including it into your process and really thinking about it as intentionally as you possibly can. And again, goes back to recognizing, where those decisions are being made and just the oversight that's required. So that would what I would say about using data to kind of inform and to govern.
Thanks. Anything to add? Okay. All right. I've got a question for you, Mark. Obviously, you work with a lot of different companies that are seeking to figure out a way to be able to accommodate and meet talent where they are. How is data helping inform the way they're shifting their workforce strategy? And I know you've talked about some of it, but I know you've got some additional kind of insights around that too.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions, because I think it's something that intuitively you kind of understand, but you struggle to answer, and it's because most recruiting kind of started out way back. It was like a second career, right? It's like your little black book, and you hired someone that knew a bunch of people because they'd built their network, and so it kind of evolved from there. But it was always localized. The world has changed, and so when you start talking about how do you think about where to build, the question that we heard the most, during COVID and post-pandemic is like, where did people go? No one knew. You didn't know where to look anymore. You kind of felt, okay, Silicon Valley's dead. Where do I go? Is it Miami? Web3, crypto? Oh my God, I gotta be there. And it's like everyone thought that every good engineer was going to be in Miami, and it turns out it's all back office financial services. Nobody knew. So I think what's really interesting is when our clients are thinking through how do they intentionally build and how do they connect that to value. So if you are in market A and you're trying to assess the feasibility of Dallas versus Denver or Dublin or Dubai, you need data. You want that to be done quickly, and historically that's been a very long, protracted, human-driven advisory research thing. And it's kind of no one picks stocks anymore by looking at yesterday's newspaper and trying to map out what was their PE ratio and everything. It's you have a Bloomberg terminal. You've got data on demand that's nimble and agile. And so companies are embracing this agile thinking to change the way they plan, and not just for the immediate 3 months, 6 months, but they're really thinking how do I become a successful employer over a multitude of years? I'm looking 18 months out, 36 months out, because when you go in and you hire 30 people at an average of $50,000 a head, you're making a multi-million-dollar investment in those people and in that location. It's not like buying a CRM system that you can pull out someone easily. So we're seeing them be really intentional, and they're beginning to get really savvy about the way that they break down data around talent in markets, and they do it head to head. They want to look at the industry, they want to look at the function, they want to look at tenure, they want to look at diversity, et cetera, and then they want to understand, can I grow into that so I don't tap out and then have to go pick the next thing and do it all over.
Absolutely. So we've been talking a lot about talent and employee experience. which also means, because of the way that we're looking at it, because it's shifting and changing, it actually also shifts and change how existing functions are supporting this, right? So before, facilities had their role, real estate had their role, HR had their role, and everybody just kind of worked in their own little silos. But we're seeing a lot of collaboration and work that's happening. You're seeing new roles pop up in the market for employee experience or head of workplace experience, things like that. What are you finding that you're seeing in the marketplace, but also the changes that you're starting to see? Because that's actually also happening for us. Like, all these different kind of like employee focused kind of functions within Remitly are also now all meeting together at least once a month. We're all on the same team, reporting to the same C-suite leader. So I'm curious to see, is that something that you're also seeing in trend? And also for you, Etawah, we haven't forgotten that you're also here with us. How are you seeing finance's role play into this kind of evolution as well? Mark, do you want to start us off? Go ahead.
Sure. So one of the things that we saw very early on was this was a cross-functional decision. And so most of our conversations were being led typically through HR, but brought in through working very closely with real estate. And then finance was always getting tacked in, right? Because it was, how do you figure out what you're going to do? What are the financial ramifications? And then where do you deploy it? How do you set it up and structure it? And it was this combination of real estate understood what was happening in those markets. Talent acquisition was saying, well, here's what I'm finding and thinking and feeling. And then you had to like roll this up and present it to someone that was trying to connect it to a business outcome. And so I think this like language is now beginning to merge and come together, where HR is elevating their ability to kind of speak business speak without just kind of like the softer language that I think HR has historically been associated with. And I always make this analogy of like, it's kind of like what quant marketing happened 15 years ago. And you kind of had like advertising agencies and the creatives give way to statisticians that showed up in marketing. But this blending of language is becoming something that everyone's recognizing is really important, to be able to say, this is why we're doing it, because it connects to a bigger outcome, not just like my internal pipeline says the following, and then you kind of lose your audience there. So that's how we see it play out.
Yeah, I think I would add, I think you're seeing a lot of these new positions pop up is because it's basically driving to get people back into the office, quite frankly. It's creating a workplace environment, creating a more, we saw DE&I as a big initiative 2 years ago, right? For me and kind of the staffing world, like, to me, I think DE&I hit like a tidal wave, and now it's kind of like receding out to the ocean in a degree, right? And now we're hitting a tidal wave with, okay, workplace environment, workplace strategy, right? Getting people back into the office, right? That's the next tidal wave that most companies are being faced with right now. So I think that's kind of driving the titles of workplace strategy. But I think more importantly, where we're at with kind of the new kind of workforce is providing them with the experience that we were accustomed to having, right? When we got into the workforce, that, and incorporating kind of a predominantly flexible environment, right? Which we all clearly don't really have a full designated answer to right now, that we're all struggling over, and so I think it's kind of a collaboration amongst folks and amongst peers in different industries to come up with a common solution, right? Which is why we're predominantly here today, right? But I think that's the driving factor right now in the current tidal wave that's hitting most corporations across all industries.
Edua?
Yeah, I find this question so fascinating, primarily because I think what I've observed is that, especially as you move further and further up an organization in these last couple of years, I think there is a need for more generalists. What do I mean by that? I think it's a little bit to the language that was just being used around just the fact that we need to be speaking the same talk, the same language, and it requires all of us to take the time to have a bit more depth around each other's roles, responsibilities, et cetera. One, to improve collaboration, but also coordination of efforts, et cetera. So I am hoping we get ahead of employee experience at ServiceNow, because right now you've got probably about 10 different people across maybe 5 different teams trying to collaborate and create without kind of a captain of that ship. And so I think it puts a little friction. I'm thinking about my ESG hat for the moment, which is, volunteering, and engagement, community engagement is a part of the employee experience at many companies. We are one input into the broader employee experience, which includes learning, development, and other ways that they can have an impact. And so we're seeing that trend directly. And I think with respect to finance's role, I think it's put to the point that was brought up already. We're getting pulled into many more of these conversations. But the reason I say many more is because I also think that the strategy has had to be quite agile, because I think to the point that was made, sometimes you're relying on data that's almost outdated the minute you get it. And so you're having to kind of continuously tinker a little bit. And I think now we're having to get creative, one as a finance function and from an advisory perspective, but then even as a business, to actually think about piloting things in a much more intentional way, and really focusing on that as a way to determine, as opposed to these opportunities to have a big splash. We're opening this massive new office, or we're opening this new space, and we're cultivating. It's almost easier to sort of, I would say, take some of those pilots and then scale them, especially in this certain environment. And I'm seeing our finance teams being challenged with modeling a lot more of that from a decisioning perspective. Of course, there's scenario analyses around a lot of these, but often these big decisions, they're just a decision, and then you get to kind of go and drive it. But I think now there's just a little bit more agility that's expected of us as a finance counterpart to the organization, that just I would say the rate of it is much more intensive than it has been historically, is what I'm observing specifically.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Sorry. Oh, no, I'm okay. Thanks. Yeah. You know how I'm like, you know how sometimes you just kind of almost choke on your own, like, saliva? Okay. So I'm good. Last question, and then we'll open it up to some audience Q&A as well. So even though we're seeing like this trend of the desire to pull everybody back in the office, the reality is that like hybrid, distributed, global, virtual teams and management of those teams has always been around and will continue to do so even in this moment as we're trying to figure out how to bring everybody back in. For each of you, and we'll just go down the line, what would be your one kind of bet, if you had the one bet, that would really help anchor companies in this moment in order to be able to retain and attract the talent that they want to be able to seek for their workplaces?
I think we're going to see companies get more comfortable taking a stance. I think they're going to feel like there's less resistance externally, that there are more companies that are committing to a similar strategy as what they're doing. So I don't sit on the side of like all remote or all in office or whatever. Like that to me isn't like necessarily the conversation to have, but it's when you can define what your company stands for and how you want to operate, and you can be really clear and you can say, this is what I like. You know, I like football, or I like baseball, or ballet, or whatever, doesn't matter. But you got to be really clear about that and consistent, because I think it's been the inconsistency of management, for right or wrong, that's created a lot of confusion and disharmony. So when you've allowed your employees to go be anywhere, then you go, just kidding. Hey, we were going to pay everyone the same way. Nope, we're going to change. Like, I think those shifts have just created a lot of mistrust and frustration. But when you set a clear point of view and you say, this is what we're about, this is what we believe in, this is our common objective, and you keep your employees engaged through meaningful work, strip out the bad stuff. Like, we'll get to generative AI, that's a cool conversation too. But like, when you strip out the redundant work and you strip out the inefficiency of their day, my experience is, and across our clients, their employees are motivated and they're working really hard and they're accomplishing, but they have a sense of purpose and clarity. So I think that sense of purpose and clarity will be the trend.
Yeah, I think, if I were to bet on what would need to be fixed, I think it's going to be training to management on the messaging and the tone of deliverability to their staff and their support staff, to create an environment and a messaging that is exciting for individuals to actually return to an office, and kind of create a pretty strong stance on what that messaging is entailing, right? Obviously, it's going to change depending upon the size of the organization, the industry, the company itself. But I think if the messaging isn't clear and concise to an additional point, I think we're going to be fighting this fight for quite some time. Like, I don't think the problem is going to be solved by any means. I think you're going to be hit with keynote speakers, just resistancy from not only just this up and coming kind of staff of new workforce, but I think it's just going to be an evolving situation. So I think it's going to be a clear, concise message that needs to be taken into the account of training to management, senior level management, and the deliverability component to their staff members.
Edua.
Yeah, I'm pretty split between the two that have already been offered. So I'm going to try to just say what I might, I guess, add sort of, but like the finer point, if I had a big bet, I think, yes, clarity and conviction around stances, perspective, points of view to rebuild the trust because it is missing. And then consistency from a messaging perspective, I'm aligned. I think I think we're going to see representation erosion before we see improvement in some of the larger organizations on the back end of some of these clarifying statements. That's my bet. What informs that is I think people are going to opt out. People are going to say, that's not for me. That's not what I want. And so there's going to be some reshuffling happening, quite a bit of it, I imagine, depending on how much of the industry, how many corporate organizations articulate their specific position. And in that reshuffling, I think leaders, businesses potentially will have the task of clarifying or understanding how their point of view may or may not be restricting their ability to attract and retain diverse talent specifically. So I think there's a risk of erosion once those statements become clear, which I do agree is what's coming next. And I think organizations will then have to really assess how important and critical diversity is to them to start that sort of rebuild, will be my hypothesis if I had to put a bet out there.
Yep, I'm with you on that bet as well, Edua. And I think too, though, the flip of that too is not every company I think is going to make the decisions the same way, right? So the ones that make the decision to say, hey, we're going to double down on this, maybe the ones that potentially win. Right. And so I think that's something to consider as we're all making those decisions right now, because I think we've been in a period of prolonged crisis management, right? And we've forgotten what long-term strategic planning is for a moment. So I think an opportunity for all of us as we kind of think about this conversation of all of our stakeholders, especially in this dialogue around employees, is how do we go back to that, the intentionality of really taking care of and managing our stakeholders. So I'll go ahead and open up some questions. Carl.
Thanks. So actually, Etawah started off at the beginning, I think of her talk, recalling a conversation she and I had that harkened back to my very first real job, which was at the Hewlett-Packard Company. There's at least one other HP Hewlett-Packard alumna here in the audience, where we had the occasionally you'd have the uncomfortable situation of sitting there in your cube or at your desk, and then Bill Hewlett would come up behind you and put his hand on your shoulder and say, "Hi, I'm Bill. What do you do? What's your name and what do you do?" And of course, he was the author of Management by Walking Around. For those, unfortunately, I'm speaking a language of a bunch of old people, and fortunately, there are a few other old people here. I wonder, and Dr. Gleb talked about poor management training, and a few of you have addressed that as well. I'm wondering how, in a hybrid world, how do you replicate virtual MBWA? Because I believe I was an unusual character in that I didn't spend my entire life at Hewlett Packard. But if you go back, I mean, it was the first company in Silicon Valley. I know not the world isn't Silicon Valley. I'll be reminded of that again. But I do believe that that sort of management culture is what made really happy, in general, really happy employees. That north to south, if you will, engagement. So how do you do that in a hybrid environment? And I'll take my answer off the air. I'd want to see.
I have this. I'll confess, it's probably the thing I struggle with the most. Just even within a small 8-person company, and probably everyone here is like, how hard could that be? Well, we've got people in multiple locations. I've got people in New York, Washington, Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala. I'm like, it's a lot, and I'm a people person, so I like to walk around. I like to know what's going on. I like to ask questions, but the only way I've been able to do it is to just bake in time. Right? I just schedule recurring meetings. I try to reach out. I will use Slack to check in. I'll try to use different mediums just to say, like, I'm thinking about you. How's it going? I just find it easier to be in person. Like, I just find it easier to sit down with someone, have a cup of coffee, but I have to meet my employee. I can't meet them all. So to me, it's just very intentional, scheduled follow-ups where I am trying to be in a listening mode, figuring out what's going on with them, figure out what they care. Are they engaged? Are they asking questions? And if Zoom is the way it's got to be done, fine. If someone wants to text me, great. I'll text you anytime, or Slack anytime. I make myself 24/7 available. I don't expect everyone else to be 24/7, but we get people that are willing to talk and share. And then our team has proactively started doing things like, let's ask funny questions. Like, if you were an animal, what were you going to be? And it kind of like breaks the ice, right? We do these icebreakers just so we can get through that. How do I get to know you? How do I get to know what you care about? So we're just kind of experimenting with some really like basic stuff to simulate being around one another and having that opportunity to like chat.
Yeah, I think I would add to that is basically employing active listening for your employees, number one. So you're actually just not like, hey, how are you doing? Just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. You actually take actionable items upon it. That's something I would do. And then the other thing I would say is some things that we're seeing amongst our clients for newer generation individuals coming into the workforce is showing a sign of vulnerability that you probably otherwise wouldn't have in an office setting, right? That breaks down barriers, that breaks down kind of shoulders, that breaks down kind of attitude or personas that might be perceived amongst a senior executive leadership, right? Because you don't have a like a face-to-face in an office, right? You can't really read their body language. You can't be here like at this type of event and network, right? So I think showing a sign of vulnerability and kind of getting to know your people to that degree will better kind of show and kind of lead by example to that experience that you had at HP, right? I think that those are kind of the two other areas that I would add to it.
Inspired by the most recent contribution, I'd say one thing that I am sort of notorious for is bringing my colleagues, my peers back to like, what is the impact of this decision on our people? So that's like one thing that I'm kind of constantly doing. And usually through that question, even if I just leave that question, then we'll start to explore, okay, well, what does this mean for our report employees? Or what does this mean for how people might be experiencing us in the leadership team? So that's like one thing that I do quite often. But even in those meetings where I might be a participant, or if I'm maybe the most senior ranking person on a call, I will ask people if they had anything they wanted to add, anything that they wanted to agree with, and I'll just invite them to like actually use their voice on the call. It depends on the size of the call, of course, but that's something that I try to put into practice. And then the other thing that I attempt to do, and I'm also very sensitive, as soon as I see someone like come off mute or something changed, I'm like, okay, someone shifted in their seat. I might just say, hey, like, is there anything you wanted to add? So I think I'm hypersensitive to that, and I try to employ that and model that. A lot of my employees have said, hey, I noticed that you're really, really good at like facilitating hybrid conversations. What are you looking for in order to do that? And I'm like, okay, well, here's some of the things that I try to be focused on. And I think the only other thing that I would add is that I do really often. I try not to have a back-to-back schedule. And in leaving space, even if it's 10 minutes between meetings, I'll reach out to someone who was on a call with me, especially a member of my team, but often sometimes a peer or just a colleague on in another organization. I'll say, hey, you got a couple minutes, just want to debrief the call we were just on. And I'll use that as a way to just connect, to hear from them directly what they thought, give me offline feedback to the point around creating vulnerability and saying, hey, I'd really like, how did I handle myself there? Did you think that worked? Was that what you were looking for from me, et cetera? But I think what I do in creating those moments of like, hey, let's just hop on a call really quick and have a conversation, is it creates a lot less formality in my engaging with my team members and with them engaging with me. They know they can just pick up the phone and ask me a question. They know that they can just reach out, because I do think we're over scheduled, we're over Zoomed, we're over what have you, but by doing it in an impromptu way where you might have walked down the hallway and said, oh, that conversation was a little strange. Like, I just find the 2 minutes to make the call to ask the same question I would have asked if I was walking down the hallway. It does mean you have to be really good at time management on a meeting. So like, I'm the one who wants to end on time, but that's just the thing that I would add, is just like finding ways to simulate that by just picking up the phone, making the call as quickly as you can, to just get their perspective, I think has helped me kind of foster a bit more connectivity.
So I love that. And I think intentional's really great. Trying to plan that. But I think what you just said is pivotal, because you guys would have walked out of a meeting room, walked down the hall, debriefed, went into maybe a little side room, high-fived if you got your strategy buy-in, or strategize quickly right after, right? So I think it's so important. Not only that, recognition is really important. And the little bit is always like, you did so great in that. Maybe some feedback, giving feedback, I think is important. Those are all things that would have happened naturally in person that I always am trying to take from every meeting or every month. And I share that with my CFO. I say, oh, this person really went above and beyond, because I think that helps, especially the remote folks, feel more connected to the business and to the team when you're all dispersed.
Is that Alana?
Yes.
Hey there again. I love that point. And actually, that's just another pointer. It could be a good tip, even if you're taking it back to some of your manager forums at your organizations. It's great. Like, some people are just uncomfortable with like public praise. I don't know many of those people, but I hear that that's a thing. But I do try in meetings to acknowledge different people for different things. It's actually something I built into my team meetings or what have you, which is just like, we have a kind of a shout out moment where I can do shout outs or other team members can do shout outs. I think that is also really important in creating like a sense of, okay, I feel seen, even though I haven't talked to Etawah in 3 weeks. Clearly my manager told her that I'm working on this thing and I got that shout out. And sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private, it's happening when they're not in the room. But I think that those things actually make people feel seen and recognized. So love the point, Alana. Thank you so much.
I think if we might wrap it up there so we can take a break and get ready for the next sessions. So round of applause for the panel, and thank you, Etawah. So great. I did check the agenda. We do have a 10-minute break. There's drinks and snacks over here. And when we come back, we're going to take a shift and move from talent into technology. So starting off with AI. So we'll get refreshed, come back, and get ready for a new topic.